Happy New Year. Are you tired of living in fear? I think it's time to kick fear to the curb in the new year. Hey, I'm Stephen K. Moore. I'm an author and a former military pilot and a former very scared person as a young person, a young adult. Had a lot of fears, anxiety, and panic attacks. Conquered all of that without drugs. I've got a new book out called Freefall, God's Path to Courage and Boldness, which takes you through the steps that God took me through to turn me into a courageous person who volunteered for combat and hostile fire zone missions. But what I want to share with you in the next few podcasts is just some of the essence of the book so that you can actually work your way through from a place of fear to a place of courage, whether you buy the book or not. First of all, I just want to talk about the story of Gideon, which is what I start the book with. If you're not familiar with the story of Gideon, he's just one of the guys in Israel who was very fearful. An angel appears to him and eventually directs him to go to war against the enemies of Israel, Midian. Tens of thousands of soldiers are in their territory. They're in their encampment, and he's told to go attack it. So he calls for the fighting men of Israel to show up. 32,000 show up, and God says, hey, that's way too many for me to work with. They end up narrowing this force down to 300 people carrying jars with torches in them and horns, and they attack and rout the Midians from the land. But there's an interesting little part of this story here where God says to Gideon, hey, you can tell anyone who's afraid that they can just go home to mama. 10,000 people, 10,000 men head home because they're afraid. It's kind of what a lot of us are doing these days. God's putting a lot of opportunity out there in our relationships, in our communities, in our churches, and whatever else God leads you into. But as always, I think he says, hey, if you're afraid, you can turn this down. And let me tell you why you don't want to do this. First of all, think about the 300 who saw this battle occur, where all they had to do, they may have been scared out of their wits, but they lined up around the enemy camp, and whenever Gideon blew his horn and shouted, they broke their pots, the torches shone, and they just stood there and watched as God took care of the battle. I want you to think about another perspective too, though. Not only would you have wanted to see that, but think about what those who left in fear experienced when they got home. Probably way short time after they left home to tell, to fight the battle, and their spouses and their children say, what, you're home so soon? And they kind of go, oh, Gideon said if we were afraid, we could go home. Wow. What an admission of cowardice. What an admission of a lack of faith. And it just, once again, think of what you missed by just giving in to your fears. Hey, folks, in the coming year and for the rest of your life, I can tell you personally, the life of courage is the life worth living. Living in fear is a living death. So join me on this journey either by podcast or get the book, Freefall, God's Path to Courage and Boldness, Stephen K. Moore. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Contact your local bookstore. They can order. It is available through Ingram Distribution Network, which supplies almost all bookstores. But whatever the case, join me on this journey for the next 12 or 13 podcasts where we're going to step you through the path of courage and boldness. Take care.